Finding connection beyond the living. Jonathan's journey. Jonathan Colmenares found it difficult to talk to people. He was the introvert of introverts, and he was so super shy that he couldn't even look his parents in the eyes. Every conversation felt awkward. Every greeting made his chest tighten. He answered questions with tiny words, stared at the floor, and counted the seconds until people walked away. His own room felt safer than the rest of the house, and silence felt like home. It was low-key his default setting, type shit. Everyone around him seemed locked into conversations while he stood outside them like background NPC energy, no cap. As a human being, Jonathan too was a social animal who needed to interact with fellow human beings. The need stayed inside him even when his fear kept winning. One evening he walked into the basement of his family's old house. Dust floated through the stale air. Wooden shelves leaned against cracked walls. A single bulb buzzed overhead. Inside a forgotten storage box rested an old dusty Ouija board with a faded alphabet, numbers, the words yes, no, and goodbye, along with an old wooden planchette. The whole setup looked vintage, kinda cursed, type shit. Jonathan placed the board on the cold concrete floor. He closed every basement window, switched off the bulb, and lit 4 small candles around the board. He sat cross-legged in front of it, placed 2 fingers lightly on the planchette, slowed his breathing, and quietly asked if any spirit wished to communicate. He repeated the invitation several times without lifting his fingers. At first nothing happened. The basement stayed silent except for the soft crackle of candle flames. Minutes later the wooden pointer slid across the board with slow, deliberate movements. Jonathan kept his fingertips resting on it without pushing. The planchette stopped over yes. His heart raced, yet he smiled for the first time in weeks. It was giving uncanny vibes, deadis. The first ghost called itself Eleanor. The planchette spelled her name letter by letter. Jonathan asked ordinary questions because extraordinary ones felt too overwhelming. He asked what the weather had looked like during her lifetime. He asked about forgotten recipes, old furniture, favorite songs, and what she missed most. Eleanor answered patiently. She never laughed at his pauses. She waited through every silence. Jonathan realized conversations became easier when nobody expected eye contact. It felt oddly wholesome, type shit. The next week another spirit introduced himself as Martin. Martin joked constantly. He mocked the squeaky basement pipes, guessed Jonathan's next question before he finished spelling it, and filled long pauses with sarcastic comments. Jonathan actually laughed. The empty basement echoed with laughter that belonged to only one living person. The air always stayed cold during Martin's visits, yet Jonathan felt strangely comfortable. It was low-key a vibe. The whole situation looked sus from the outside, but for Jonathan it felt completely normal. Months passed. Jonathan developed routines. Every evening he cleaned the Ouija board with a soft cloth, lit fresh candles, rested 2 fingers on the planchette, welcomed whichever ghost answered first, and ended every session by sliding the planchette to goodbye before carefully putting the board away. Because every session began and ended the same way, every spirit arrived and departed through the same ritual. There were rules, consistency, and closure. Human conversations rarely offered him that kind of certainty. Ghosts always respected the ending. Humans kept conversations alive with expectations. Jonathan preferred the first option, father. Soon he spoke with dozens of ghosts. One loved discussing forgotten cities. Another spent hours explaining card games nobody remembered anymore. One simply wanted someone to listen while recounting ordinary afternoons from decades ago. Jonathan listened without interrupting. The ghosts listened back with the same patience. They became his friends. His basement became his social world. Every evening felt like another private group chat, except everyone had been dead for years. It was straight up surreal, type shit. Eventually something changed inside him. Whenever a conversation stopped being interesting, Jonathan calmly thanked the ghost, moved the planchette to goodbye, and completed the banishing ritual. The candles went out. The basement returned to silence. His friend disappeared instantly. No arguments. No awkward explanations. No lingering expectations. Another ghost always arrived the next evening anyway. Jonathan found the process incredibly comforting. Conversations had clean endings. Relationships had clean endings. His control over those endings became part of the comfort. It hit different, no cap. One afternoon he watched neighbors chatting outside through his bedroom window. They interrupted each other, misunderstood each other, laughed at different moments, argued over tiny details, then continued talking anyway. Jonathan imagined ending the conversation the same way he ended conversations with ghosts. There was no planchette, no ritual, No goodbye that could quietly remove another person from his world. Human beings continued existing with their own choices regardless of what he wanted. That realization settled into his mind with complete clarity. Jonathan accepted himself for who he was. He stopped trying to interact with humans. He stopped forcing greetings. He stopped rehearsing conversations that never happened. Every evening he returned to the basement, arranged the candles, placed the Ouija board on the floor, rested 2 fingers on the planchette, invited the spirits to speak, and welcomed whichever familiar ghost arrived first. The basement stayed full. The rest of the world stayed distant. That arrangement finally made sense to him. From that day on, Jonathan only began to interact with ghosts.